The Magnate's Reckoning, A Father's Redemption. Subscribe to my channel to learn how to turn your pain into power. He tore her ultrasound to pieces and walked away. 3 years later, he saw her again, sitting at the next table with 3 little girls who had his eyes. Leonardo Valente sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the late afternoon light filtering through the tall glass windows of his office and painting the room in amber tones. He wore a light brown, tailored suit, the kind that spoke of power and perfection, and his piercing brown eyes reflected both exhaustion and impatience. Sophia stood in front of him, her hands trembling, a folded piece of paper held tightly. Her dark hair framed her pale face, and her blue eyes shone with a mixture of hope and fear. She had rehearsed this moment so many times in her head, telling herself that maybe, just maybe, he would understand. Slowly, she held out the paper to him, the ultrasound that had been her companion on sleepless nights. For a brief second, Leonardo's gaze softened as he looked at the image, the faint outline of a tiny life taking shape. But the softness vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a hardness that Sophia had learned to recognize all too well in him. Without a word, he reached out, took the paper, and, with a swift motion, tore it in half. The sound of the rip seemed louder than anything else in the world in that moment, echoing in her ears like a cruel reminder of reality. He let the pieces fall onto his desk, fragments of what could have been, and leaned back in his chair with a cold, practiced expression. "I'm not ready for this," his measured, almost indifferent voice said. "I can't deal with something like this now. Forget it." Sophia felt her knees weaken, as if the floor beneath her had shifted. Her chest tightened, and tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. She searched his face for the smallest sign of remorse, some spark of the man she had once believed him to be, the one capable of love. Instead, all she saw was distance, a wall she could never climb. The weight of his rejection pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless. She wanted to scream, to ask him how he could be so heartless, to demand that he see what she saw in that small, blurred image. But no words came out. Her throat burned, and her hands, now empty, felt unbearably cold. She turned, her steps uncertain, each one heavier than the last, as she moved toward the door. Behind her, Leonardo remained motionless, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the urban skyline, as if the world outside his window mattered more than the life he had just denied. When Sophia finally left the office, the door closing softly behind her, she knew that something inside her had broken. The ultrasound was gone, torn into meaningless pieces, but the truth she carried still lived within her. In that moment, she understood that she was alone, completely and irreversibly alone, and that her life had just changed forever. Have you ever faced a moment where a single act of cruelty changed everything you believed in? How would you have found the strength to move forward? Let us know in the comments below. The small apartment smelled of damp walls and old wood, a world away from the gleaming glass office she had left behind. Sophia sat on the edge of her narrow bed, clutching her stomach as if she could protect the fragile lives within her from the storm outside. The city lights twinkled through the thin curtains, and the hum of passing cars reminded her that the world went on, indifferent to her pain. She had walked out of Leonardo's office with nothing but the broken pieces of hope, and now she was confronted with the deafening silence of solitude. The reality of what lay ahead pressed against her chest, heavier with each passing day. The doctors had not been kind with their warnings. The pregnancy was high risk, they said, and when the word triplets left the doctor's mouth, Sophia felt her world tilt. 3 children, not 1, not 2, but 3 tiny lives to depend solely on her. The enormity of it left her trembling, caught between terror and awe. At night, she lay awake, her body aching, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. How would she work? How would she feed them? Could she even survive the birth? Each uncertainty cut her like a knife, but beneath it all pulsed a fierce, unshakable determination. Her family was far away, distant not just in miles, but in heart. She had chosen a path that had estranged her from them years ago, and she knew she couldn't go back now to beg for support. Friends were also scarce, scattered across the city with their own lives, unprepared to bear the weight of her secret. She carried it alone, rising every morning with swollen eyes and dragging herself through the day, clinging to the idea that she was fighting for something bigger than herself. The loneliness was sharp, almost physical, a constant companion that whispered in the silent corners of her mind that she had been abandoned. But then she would put her hand on her stomach and feel the faint flutter, the fragile reminder that she was not entirely alone. They were there, growing, waiting, delicate, yet resilient. The sound of 3 heartbeats on the monitor during her last appointment had stayed with her, filling her ears long after the doctor had left the room. It was both a burden and a blessing, a sign that, against all odds, life insisted on moving forward. She found herself whispering promises in the quiet of the night, telling them she would never give up on them, that she would give everything she had to bring them safely into the world. Her body ached as the months wore on, the weight of 3 children testing her limits in ways she had never imagined. Her ankles swelled, her back ached, and there were nights when the pain made her curl up and cry into the thin pillow, muffling her sobs so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Yet even in her darkest moments, when fear clutched her and the shadow of despair stretched long across the walls, there was a spark that refused to die. The ultrasound image may have been torn to pieces by Leonardo, but inside her, those tiny lives were whole, untouched by his rejection. She carried them with pride and a kind of painful love, a love that grew stronger with each day she survived the solitude. The apartment may have been cold, her meals sparse, her bank account nearly empty, but her will was intact. She would not let Leonardo's decision define her children's future. She would stand in the storm, battered but unbowed, because what was growing inside her was worth every sacrifice. The night was long and heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional shuffling of nurses' shoes echoing down the sterile hospital corridors. Sophia lay on the delivery bed, drenched in sweat, her dark hair plastered to her temples, as waves of pain tore through her with a relentless rhythm. She had known this day would be brutal, that bringing 3 children into the world would test every boundary she had, but knowing and living were 2 entirely different things. Each contraction felt like fire tearing through her, yet she held on to the idea that with every scream, her battle would give birth to life. Her fingers gripped the edge of the sheet as another contraction raged, and she cried out, her voice raw, her strength fading, but unwilling to surrender. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her, their voices a mixture of urgency and encouragement. "Stay with us, Sophia. You can do this," one of them said, while another adjusted the monitors that tracked not 1 but 3 heartbeats. The sound of those tiny pulses filled the room, steady and insistent, reminding her why she could not give up. When the first child finally arrived, the cry pierced the air, raw and fragile, and Sophia's vision blurred with tears. Her heart swelled painfully as she glimpsed a tiny, red, wrinkled face with tufts of brown hair glowing under the harsh hospital light. Before she could even process it, the next wave of pain consumed her, dragging her deeper into the storm. The second baby followed, and then the third, each arrival accompanied by cries that sounded like a choir, overlapping and intertwining into a sound so pure and overwhelming that Sophia could barely breathe. The exhaustion was immense, her body shaking violently, her chest heaving with short breaths, and she felt as if she would break into pieces. But in the midst of the chaos, she was overcome with awe. She had done it, against the odds, against the loneliness, against the weight of rejection and fear. She had brought 3 new lives into the world. The nurses worked quickly, wrapping the newborns in soft blankets, and one by one, they were brought to her side. When the first bundle was placed in her arms, Sophia's heart seemed to stop. The baby's tiny fingers curled instinctively, clutching her skin as if to say, "I am here." Her tears now fell freely, rolling down her cheeks as she whispered their names in a shaky voice. Clara, Leonore, Madalena. Each name carried a piece of her heart, each child a miracle that had been denied by a man, but embraced entirely by her. She looked at them, shocked by how much they already resembled Leonardo, with their dark eyelashes and the faintest hint of his brown eyes. It was like looking at pieces of him, remnants of the past she wanted to forget, yet they were hers, entirely hers, and in that moment she felt no bitterness, only an overwhelming wave of love. Her exhaustion was crushing, but the weight of 3 warm, fragile lives against her chest filled her with a strength she thought had long disappeared. The pain and fear melted away, replaced by an almost sacred stillness. She pressed her lips against each tiny forehead, inhaling the faint smell of newborn skin, and silently promised them that no matter how hard life became, they would never know abandonment, not from her. Her body was weak, her mind spent, but her heart burned fiercely, now tethered to 3 little souls who depended on her completely. The room around her faded into insignificance. The machines, the sterile walls, the rushing nurses. It all became a blur in the background as Sophia sat rocking her daughters, tears of joy mixed with tears of exhaustion. She had never felt so completely broken, and yet so profoundly whole. In one night, the solitude of years was replaced by a fragile but powerful sense of belonging. She was no longer just Sophia, the woman who had been left behind. She was a mother, and not just of one, but of 3 little miracles who had chosen to fight their way into the world by her side. What kind of mother would Sophia be after such a difficult start? How would she teach her children about their father? Share your thoughts. The years that followed blurred into a torrent of sleepless nights, endless responsibilities, and a love so fierce it sometimes frightened Sophia. Their small apartment became both a battlefield and a sanctuary, its cramped rooms filled with the cries, laughter, and chaos of 3 growing girls. Every morning began before sunrise with the sound of Clara calling out, her tiny voice waking her sisters, and soon all 3 were clamoring for attention, food, and comfort. Sophia, exhausted and running on fragments of rest, would gather them close, preparing bottles, spoon-feeding them oatmeal, changing diapers, and settling arguments before she even had time to look at the clock. The weight of raising them alone pressed against her chest daily, but the sight of their wide eyes and innocent smiles gave her the strength to carry on, even when her body screamed for relief. Work became a relentless struggle. She held 2 jobs, cleaning offices in the early mornings and working late shifts at a restaurant to put food on the table and a roof over their heads. Her feet constantly ached, Her back never seemed to relax from the tension, and sometimes she would come home so tired she could barely lift the girls into bed. Yet, when Clara, Leonor, and Madalena would cuddle up against her at night, their little arms wrapping around her as if she were their entire world, the fatigue would dissolve into something bearable. She would whisper stories to them in the dark, tales of princesses who survived impossible trials, never confessing that these stories were, in fact, her own hopes for them, disguised as fairy tales. The girls grew quickly, identical in appearance, but already revealing different personality traits. Clara was the bold one, always the first to try new things and test her mother's patience with a sassy curiosity. Leonor was the gentler one, prone to quiet observation and sudden bursts of affection, the child who would climb into Sophia's lap, unbidden just to rest her head against her chest. Madalena, the youngest by minutes, seemed to carry the weight of her sister's energy, mischievous and laughing non-stop, turning even the most difficult moments into unexpected joy. Together, they filled every corner of the apartment with life, their voices echoing off the thin walls until the neighbors frequently complained. Sophia would apologize with tired smiles, but inside she cherished the noise, for it reminded her daily that she was no longer alone. There were nights, however, when the solitude would creep back in with a suffocating intensity. After the girls were finally asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table, looking at bills she could barely afford to pay, wondering how much longer she could keep everything from falling apart. Her hands would shake as she scribbled numbers, calculating and recalculating until the ink blurred on the page. But no matter how grim the math looked, she refused to let despair win. She thought of Leonardo sometimes, the man who had denied them, and for a fleeting moment, anger would rise in her chest. But then she would look at her daughters sleeping peacefully in their shared bed, their identical faces serene and trusting, and that anger would melt away. They were worth every sacrifice, and she vowed repeatedly that she would shield them from ever feeling unwanted. As the third year approached, Sophia realized how much they had all grown together. The girls could walk, talk, laugh, and sing, their personalities blossoming like wildflowers, despite the cracks in the asphalt of their lives. Her body carried the marks of exhaustion, her eyes with dark circles that never seemed to disappear. But her spirit was stronger than it had ever been. Every milestone, first steps, first words, the first time all three of them called her Mommy in unison, was etched into her memory as treasures she clung to during the darkest days. She lived on the edge of survival, but within that struggle she had discovered a love so overwhelming that not even the memory of rejection could dim its shine. Sophia's life was hard, brutally so, but she had created a home where love outweighed scarcity, where laughter rose above worry, and where three little girls were flourishing against the odds. Her existence was no longer hers. It belonged to Clara, Leonor, and Madalena. And though her body ached and her spirit was tested daily, she wouldn't trade a single hardship, for those three sets of brown eyes had become the very reason she kept breathing. The small restaurant was warm and noisy, filled with the hum of voices, the clinking of silverware, and the sweet smell of baking bread. Sophia was sitting at a corner table with her daughters, their small hands sticky with ice cream, as they laughed and argued over who had the biggest scoop. Clara leaned forward, her brown eyes wide with determination, as she insisted she deserved another spoonful, while Madalena reached across the table to steal from her sister's bowl, laughing so hard she almost knocked over her chair. Leonor, ever the peacemaker, tried to distract them by pointing to the colorful lights hanging from the ceiling. Their giggles rose above the restaurant's chatter, drawing fond smiles from nearby patrons. Sophia watched them with a tired but proud smile, pushing a stray lock of dark hair from her face as she helped them wipe their sticky fingers and guided the spoons back to their bowls before too much spilled onto the table. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the constant weight of responsibility and simply savored the sound of her daughter's joy. Then, she felt an awareness that someone was watching. At first, she ignored it, assuming it was just the natural curiosity people often showed when they realized the three girls were identical. But when she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Across the room, at a table not far from theirs, sat Leonardo Valente. He was impeccably dressed as always, in another light brown suit that hugged his broad shoulders, his hair neatly combed, his presence imposing even in a casual setting. He looked older, more serious, but in his expression there was something new, something fragile that flickered when his gaze fell upon her table. Sophia froze, her heart beating so hard she thought it might break. She wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, but his eyes had already locked onto hers, and the years between them vanished in an instant. Leonardo's gaze shifted from her face to the three girls beside her, and Sophia saw the exact moment the truth hit him. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened, and yet there was no denying what he saw. Clara, Leonor, and Maddalena turned to him with curious looks, their brown eyes, his eyes, shining under the restaurant lights. The resemblance was undeniable. Sophia's breath trembled as she looked at her daughters, and then back at the man who had once torn up the very proof of their existence. He looked as if someone had pulled the floor out from under him, the polished veneer of the powerful CEO cracking as recognition seeped into his features. Sophia's chest tightened with conflicting emotions. Anger flared within her, memories of that office, of the ultrasound ripped in two, of the words, "forget it," echoing in her ears. But next to the anger was a hurt, an old wound torn open again, and beneath it all, a strange and fragile sense of vindication. He could no longer deny them. The evidence was alive, breathing, laughing, and looking at him with his own brown eyes. Leonardo finally found his voice, though it was broken and uncertain. "They look just like me," he whispered, almost to himself, as if he still needed to say it aloud to believe it. He reached out a trembling hand, but stopped it halfway, uncertain, his fingers curling into a fist. "I didn't know. I didn't—" He cut himself off, his throat closing with the weight of the truth he had avoided for so long. Sophia's gaze hardened, and she shook her head slowly. "You did know," she said calmly, her words sharper than any shouted accusation. "I showed you, and you ripped it up. You told me to forget it, and I had no choice but to carry it all alone." Her voice cracked slightly, but she held her chin high, refusing to let him see the tears that threatened to rise. The girls exchanged glances, too young to understand the history unfolding between their mother and the stranger, yet old enough to feel its importance. Clara asked, "Mommy, who is he?" And Sophia's heart tightened at the question. She looked at their innocent faces, at the trust in their eyes, and swallowed the lump in her throat. "He's someone from a long time ago," she answered softly, her words deliberately vague, even though the truth hung heavy in the air. Leonardo flinched at the distance in her tone, the way she spoke as if he were nothing more than a ghost from the past. For 3 years, he had lived in his empire of wealth and power, believing himself untouchable. But now he felt naked before 3 small children and the woman who had survived without him. The weight of shame pressed down on him until his shoulders hunched, and he found himself struggling to breathe. "Sophia," he said again, her name escaping his lips like a plea. "I made a mistake. the worst mistake of my life. Please, let me explain. Let me. She cut him off with a raised hand, her blue eyes shining. Explain what? That you were too proud, too scared, too selfish to face reality. There's nothing you can say that can erase the nights I spent awake wondering if they would survive, or the mornings I went to work on no sleep because I had no one else to lean on. You weren't there, Leonardo. I was. Her voice trembled, but grew stronger with each word, and for the first time he saw the depth of her strength, a strength born of years of struggle and sacrifice. Around them the restaurant went on, as if nothing had changed. Plates clinked, conversations buzzed, and laughter drifted from other tables. But at theirs, the world seemed suspended in silence, the air thick with unspoken truths. Leonardo stood rooted, looking at the children who bore his features and the woman he had once rejected. Sophia, her hand still resting protectively on Leonor's shoulder, refused to give in, her presence unshakable despite the storm raging in her heart. He wanted to reach out across the distance. For the first time in his life, he understood that not everything could be bought, controlled, or demanded. The truth was here, alive and undeniable, and it demanded something of him that money and power could never provide. That night, Leonardo lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling as the city lights bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, mocking him with their brilliance. For years he had built his empire brick by brick, deal by deal, believing that success and wealth would protect him from regret, that power would silence any doubts about the choices he had made. But Sophia's words echoed in his mind with a force he couldn't escape. He saw again the image of 3 little girls, their brown eyes reflecting his own, their laughter sharp as a knife because it revealed everything he had lost. The sound haunted him, and for the first time in years, he felt powerless, stripped of the illusion that his life was whole. He pressed his hands against his face, but the weight of shame pressed harder, and no amount of whiskey or distraction could drown it out. He thought back to that day in his office, the moment Sophia had stood before him, her hands trembling, and he had ripped up the only proof of life she had had the courage to share. The memory now burned with a searing clarity, and he couldn't believe how cold he had been. At the time, he had told himself he was protecting his career, protecting his carefully constructed life, convincing himself that fatherhood would only ruin everything he had worked for. Now those justifications sounded hollow, pathetic even, compared to the reality of what he had lost. He had abandoned not just Sophia, but 3 daughters who could have known him from the start, who could have reached for his hand, who could have grown up with his laughter instead of his absence. The thought clawed at his chest until he could barely breathe. How would you feel if a man who had abandoned you suddenly appeared in your life and wanted to be a father to your children? What conditions would you set for him? Share your thoughts below. In the morning, his reflection in the mirror looked strange to him. The carefully styled hair, the expensive suit, the flawless mask of confidence seemed meaningless, almost ridiculous. Beneath the surface was a man hollowed out by guilt, a man who had achieved everything society told him mattered, and yet found himself stripped of the one thing that truly did. He made his way to Sophia's small apartment, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. The building was modest, a stark contrast to the glittering towers where he lived, and he hesitated at the door, almost turning back. But then he remembered the way Clara had tilted her head at him, curious and unafraid, and the way Sophia's voice had trembled with strength and pain. He knocked, uncertain if she would even let him speak. Sophia opened the door with cautious eyes, her dark hair pulled back loosely, the fatigue etched onto her features. She looked at him not with surprise, but with resignation, as if she had known he would come, but had no faith in what he might say. The laughter of the girls echoed faintly from inside, a stark reminder of what he had lost, and Leonardo felt his throat tighten. "Please, let me talk," he said softly, his voice stripped of the authority it once carried. Sophia crossed her arms, her posture rigid, her blue eyes sharp. "Talk? After 3 years of silence? After I begged you to see me, to see them? Where were you when I was working 2 jobs just to put food on the table? Where were you when they were sick? When they cried in the night? When I thought I wouldn't survive another day? You can't just show up now and act like words will fix everything." Her anger was silent but devastating, each sentence hitting harder than the last. Leonardo lowered his gaze, his chest heavy with shame. He wanted to explain that he had been afraid, that he had convinced himself he was incapable of being a father, that he had buried his conscience beneath layers of success. But as he looked at her, fighting so fiercely despite the exhaustion she carried, he realized his excuses were meaningless. He knelt, a man unrecognizable from the proud executive who had once dismissed her, and his voice cracked as he said, "I was wrong. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve you or them, but I want to try. Let me be a part of their lives. Let me make even the smallest repairs. Please, Sophia, I can't undo the past, but I will spend the rest of my life trying if you'll let me." Sophia's breath caught in her throat at the sight of him kneeling, his polished exterior shattered. For a long moment she said nothing, torn between the fury that had kept her going for 3 years and the faint, dangerous spark of hope she had buried deep within herself. From behind her, the sound of Clara, Leonor, and Maddalena playing drifted into the room, their voices bright and unbroken, and she looked at them with the kind of love that had carried her through every hardship. When she looked back at Leonardo, her expression was hard, her voice firm. "You will never know the weight of what you put us through," she said, "and nothing you do will ever erase it. If you want to prove that you're more than the man who walked away, then show me, show them. Don't just say the words. Live them." Leonardo nodded, his chest tight with relief and dread. He understood now that this wasn't a simple plea for forgiveness, but a test of his soul, an ordeal that would demand more of him than any business deal ever had. He rose slowly, humbled, carrying the heavy knowledge that redemption would not come quickly, if it came at all. Yet in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt a fragile sense of purpose rise within him. He had 3 daughters and a woman who had survived his absence, and though he didn't yet deserve them, he would fight with everything he had to earn his place in their lives. The months that followed were unlike anything Leonardo had ever known. The man who once measured his worth in contracts and quarterly reports now measured his days in small victories. The way Clara's laughter would change from cautious to free when he lifted her into his arms at the park, the way Leonor's shy glances would soften into trust as she reached for his hand, and the way Maddalena would climb into his lap, uninvited, and pull on his tie until he abandoned his phone to give her his full attention. In the beginning, the girls were hesitant, curious but distant, their young hearts uncertain of who this stranger was. Yet children have a way of sensing the truth, and they quickly saw that he was trying. He stumbled often, burning breakfast more times than he cared to admit, and making clumsy attempts at braiding hair that ended in tangles. But he showed up every day, and in time, his persistence became its own kind of love. Sophia watched this transformation with a guarded heart. She had spent years convincing herself that she didn't need him, that he was nothing but a painful memory. And now, here he was in her kitchen, kneeling on the floor to help Maddalena build towers with mismatched blocks, while Clara corrected him on how to stack them. There were nights she would lie awake wondering if she was a fool for letting him back into their lives, haunted by the memory of torn paper and broken promises. Yet when she heard the girls' squeals of delight as he twirled them in the living room, or when she overheard him coming home from his office just to sit cross-legged on the floor and read bedtime stories until his voice was hoarse, she felt her walls weaken. His remorse was not in his words, but in his actions, repeated over and over until they began to feel less like penance and more like devotion. It wasn't an easy road. There were arguments, old wounds reopened without warning, moments when Sophia's anger would surface with raw intensity. She demanded answers for nights he could never give back, for years of silence, and Leonardo met each confrontation without defense, accepting her fury as his cross to bear. He didn't beg for shortcuts to forgiveness. Instead, he let the weight of his mistakes hang heavy upon him, a reminder of the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sharp boundaries between them began to soften, carved away by time, patience, and the simple rhythm of shared life. One evening, months after that first encounter at the restaurant, Sophia stood in the doorway of the girls' room, watching as Leonardo tucked them into bed. Clara insisted on one more story. Leonor whispered a secret in his ear that made him smile, and Maddalena refused to sleep unless she held his hand. He stayed there long after their eyelids had grown heavy, his tall frame hunched over the tiny bed, his expression tender in a way Sophia had never seen before. Something shifted inside her as she watched him, not with the reckless hope of the girl she had once been, but with the cautious faith of a woman who had endured and survived. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe people could change, that perhaps even the deepest wounds could heal. Later that night, when the apartment was silent and the city hummed softly beyond the windows, Sophia sat at the kitchen table while Leonardo tidied up the dishes unbidden. He moved with a kind of reverence, as if even the smallest tasks mattered, and when he finally sat across from her, the silence between them was not heavy, but alive with something unsaid. She looked at him for a long time, seeing both the man who had hurt her and the man who was learning, day by day, to make amends. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, when she finally spoke. "I forgive you." The words hung in the air, trembling with pain and relief, and Leonardo froze, his eyes filling with tears he didn't try to hide. He reached across the table, and when his hand found hers, it wasn't the start of a fairy tale, but the fragile beginning of something real. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and shadows from the past, but Sophia no longer carried the burden alone. Her daughters, 3 beautiful, bright reflections of his failures and her hope, had bound them together in a way that nothing else could. For the first time in years, Sophia felt her heart relax, and Leonardo felt the weight of redemption settle in his bones. The story of their lives had been marked by abandonment and pain, but as they sat together in that small apartment, with the sound of their daughters breathing in the next room, they knew that their ending, though imperfect, had finally found its beginning.